The night my stepmother decided to teach me a lesson. I was 26 years old, 3 months into a new job, and still naive enough to think that the people who raised me actually wanted good things for me. I want to tell you what happened, all of it. Because for a long time I couldn't talk about it without my hand shaking. Now I can. And I think some of you need to hear this. My dad remarried when I was 14. My mom had passed 2 years before that, breast cancer, fast and brutal, and my dad spent those 2 years grieving so hard he basically stopped being a parent. I don't blame him for that anymore. But I do remember being 12 and 13, and figuring out how to do laundry and grocery shop and remind him to eat, while also going to middle school and pretending everything was fine. So by the time he brought home my stepmother, I was already used to taking care of myself. Her name was, and I'm going to call her what I called her in my head for 12 years, the administrator, because that's what she felt like. Not a mother, not even a stepmother, a manager. Someone who had taken over the household the way a new CEO takes over a struggling company. Efficient, humorless, deeply interested in controlling where the money went. She wasn't cruel in ways that left marks. She was cruel in ways that made you question your own memory afterward. The kind of cruelty that, when you tried to explain it to someone, made them tilt their head and say, "Are you sure that's what she meant?" Like the time she told me my college acceptance letters were impressive, but let's be realistic. Or the time she handed me a printed spreadsheet, an actual printed spreadsheet, outlining exactly what I owed the household for the months I'd lived there after turning 18. Or the time I came home from my first semester of college with a 3.7 GPA, and she spent the whole dinner talking about how my stepbrother had gotten a full athletic scholarship. My dad never said anything. He'd learned to be quiet around her the same way I had. I think he thought that was peace. I used to think it was cowardice. Now I think it was exhaustion. He'd used up all his fight grieving my mom and he didn't have any left. I moved out at 22. Got a small apartment 40 minutes away, worked 2 jobs through my last 2 years of college, graduated, got a real job in HR at a logistics company. I was proud of myself. Quietly, privately proud. The way you get proud when you know nobody who should be cheering for you actually is. I still went home for holidays. I don't know why. Habit, I guess. Or hope. The particular kind of hope that never fully dies even when it probably should. And that's where this story really starts. It was November, the weekend before Thanksgiving. My dad had called, which was rare, because usually the administrator screened those calls, and asked if I'd come down early to help set things up. His voice sounded thin, tired. I said yes before I finished thinking about it. I drove down on a Friday evening after work. 3 hours. I had my overnight bag and a grocery bag of stuff I'd picked up because I knew from experience that the administrator would find something wrong with whatever I brought, but at least I'd feel like I tried. When I got there, my stepbrother was already home. I'm going to call him Chip, because he's exactly the kind of 24-year-old who goes by a nickname his mother gave him unironically. Chip was on the couch playing something on his Xbox, and he looked up when I walked in and said, "Oh, you're here," with all the enthusiasm of someone who'd just been informed about a minor plumbing issue. The administrator came out of the kitchen. She was wearing an apron, which she always did when I visited, because she knew it made her look domestic and welcoming in a way that was harder to argue with. She smiled at me. That particular smile, the one that always reminded me of a customer service rep who is very much not on your side. "We weren't sure you'd make it," she said. I had confirmed 3 times. By text. She had responded to all 3. "Traffic was fine," I said. "Hey, Dad." My dad was in the armchair by the window. He looked older than the last time I'd seen him. He smiled at me, a real smile, the kind he used to give me when I was little, and I felt the familiar ache of loving someone who was also a little bit of a disappointment. Dinner was fine, by which I mean it was the kind of fine that is held together with surface politeness and careful subject changes. The administrator talked about Chip's gym progress. Chip ate a lot of food and talked about a guy he knew who was starting a cryptocurrency thing. My dad nodded in the places he was supposed to. I kept my voice neutral and thought about what time I'd leave tomorrow. After dinner, while my dad and Chip were watching football, the administrator came to find me in the kitchen. I was washing dishes. I'd started doing that without being asked years ago, as a kind of armor, because it was harder to criticize someone who was already helping. She stood in the doorway. She did that thing where she waited until you looked at her first. I looked up. "I wanted to talk to you about the holidays," she said, going forward. She had a way of phrasing things as if she were announcing policy changes, going forward like I was an employee receiving a memo. Okay, I said. It's been wonderful having you here over the years. Pause, but I think we both know that the dynamic hasn't always been comfortable for anyone. I turned the water off, I dried my hands on the dish towel. I looked at her and I kept my face completely blank because I had spent years practicing that. What do you mean? I asked, even though I knew exactly what she meant. She was asking me not to come anymore. She was asking me to stop coming to my father's house for the holidays. And she was doing it in the language of mutual agreement, as though I'd been the problem this whole time. As though the discomfort was something we had both created equally. She talked for about 4 more minutes. I don't remember all of it. I remember phrases. Your father's health, stress triggers, fresh start, will always be here if you really need something. I kept waiting for my voice to break. It didn't. When she finished, I nodded once. I said, I hear you. And I went back to my childhood bedroom, which had been converted into a home office with a pull-out couch, and I sat on the edge of that pull-out couch and I looked at the wall. I did not cry, I wanted to. But I'd used up a lot of my crying on these people over the years, and I'd started to notice that crying never actually changed anything with them. It just made me feel worse. I thought about calling a friend. My best friend from college, Ren, had been through something similar with her own family, and she had a way of saying exactly the right thing. But it was late, and I didn't want to do the whole thing that night. I didn't want to process, I wanted to sit with it first. I lay down on the pull-out couch in my father's home office, surrounded by filing cabinets and his old fishing trophies, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought, okay, so that's where we are. I also thought about money. Because here's the thing about the administrator that I hadn't fully reckoned with until that moment. I was still on my dad's health insurance. I was 26. The cutoff under my plan was 26. And I was 90 days into my new job, which meant I was still in the waiting period before my own employer coverage kicked in. 3 more months. I had 3 more months where I was technically dependent on my father's insurance. I hadn't thought about it consciously, but she had, I was sure of it. The next morning I got up early. My dad was in the kitchen making coffee, just him. The house was quiet the way it only gets before everyone else wakes up, and for a second it felt like being 12 again, standing in the kitchen with him before school. Morning, kiddo, he said. Morning. He poured me a cup without asking. He knew how I took it, even after everything. That was the thing about my dad. He hadn't forgotten. He'd just gotten very good at looking away. I sat down at the kitchen table. I wrapped both hands around the mug, and I said, quietly, she asked me not to come back. He didn't say anything right away. He stood at the counter with his back to me, and I watched his shoulders do something complicated. She mentioned she wanted to talk to you, he finally said. Did she mention what about? He turned around. He looked at me. And I saw it. The apology that would never come out right. The guilt that had nowhere to go because he'd spent too long not doing anything with it. She worries about the tension, he said. She thinks it's hard for everyone. It's hard for everyone, I repeated. Okay, sweetheart, I'm fine, Dad. I took a sip of coffee. I just wanted you to know that I know. I left after breakfast. I hugged my dad for a few seconds longer than usual, because I wasn't sure when I'd be able to do that again under comfortable circumstances, and I got in my car and I drove 40 minutes back toward home, and somewhere around mile 23 I pulled into a gas station parking lot, and cried for about 10 minutes in the way you do when you've been holding something for too long. Then I wiped my face. I got a bottle of water from inside, and I started thinking. I called Ren that afternoon. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a second, and then she said, okay, what do you want to do? Not what should you do. Not here's what I would do. What do I want to do? I thought about it, really thought. I want to not need them, I said. I want to be in a position where they can't hold anything over me. Okay, she said, so let's figure that out. The first thing was the insurance. I called my HR department on Monday morning and asked about the options for bridging coverage during the waiting period. My HR rep, honestly one of the most useful humans I've ever interacted with, walked me through a COBRA option that my previous employer's plan still had available, and also a marketplace plan that, given my income bracket, would be subsidized enough to be manageable. It would cost me money, not a catastrophic amount. A manageable amount if I restructured some things. I said yes to the marketplace plan. I enrolled that week. I did not tell my dad. I did not tell the administrator. The second thing was to look very carefully at what else connected me to them. It wasn't much, I'd been independent for years, but I found one more thing. My name was still on a joint savings account my dad had opened for me when I was 17. It had almost nothing in it, we're talking $40-something, but it existed, and it meant they could theoretically see my deposit information if they ever decided to look. I went to my bank, I closed that account. I opened a new one, just mine. The third thing took longer. It was less practical and more personal. I wrote out, over about 3 weeks in a notes app on my phone, every incident I could remember. Not to show anyone. Just to get it out of my body and onto something I could look at. 12 years of moments that had seemed small when they happened, but had accumulated into something that was actually quite heavy. The spreadsheet of what I owed the household. The college thing. The holiday dinners where I'd been made to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome. The phone calls that were always about what my stepbrother was doing well. The years of being told that the way I felt about things was an overreaction. I didn't share the list, I just made it. And something about making it, about looking at it laid out, one after another, made something shift for me. It wasn't anger exactly. It was more like clarity. Like finally being allowed to see the whole picture instead of just the piece they'd handed me at a time. 4 months passed. I want to be honest here, those 4 months were not easy. There were nights when I second-guessed everything. When I thought maybe I was the difficult one, maybe she was right that the tension was mutual. I'd spent so many years being told that my perception was the problem that it took active effort every day to trust what I actually remembered. Ren helped. A therapist I started seeing in February helped. The therapist had this way of asking, "What would you say to a friend who told you this story?" And the answer, every time, was something I would never actually say to myself. In March, my dad called. Not the administrator, my dad himself, which still always surprised me a little. He sounded the way he'd sounded at the kitchen table, careful, slightly ashamed. "We're doing Easter," he said, "the whole family, your aunt and uncle are coming down." A pause. "I'd like you to be there." I didn't answer right away. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the fact that I now had my own insurance, my own account, my own record of 12 years. I thought about Ren saying, "What do you want to do?" "I'll think about it," I said. I didn't go. I sent my dad a card, handwritten, that said I loved him and I missed him and I wasn't ready yet. I didn't mention the administrator, I didn't explain, I just said what was true. He texted back 2 days later, "I understand, I love you too." That was more than I'd expected, more than I was used to. I read it about 5 times and then I made myself put my phone down. What happened in April I did not plan. I want to be clear about that. My stepbrother called me. Chip, who had said approximately 40 words to me over the course of my entire adolescence, called me on a Tuesday evening while I was making dinner. I almost didn't answer. I almost let it go to voicemail, because nothing about Chip calling me in the evening felt like good news. But I answered. "Hey," he said. He sounded weird, younger than usual. Mom kind of told me what happened in November. I kept stirring whatever was in the pot." "Okay," I said. "I didn't know she was going to do that," he said. "I want you to know that. I know that probably doesn't matter, but..." "It matters a little," I said. And then I didn't say anything else because I wanted to hear what he was going to say next. What he said was, "She does that. She's always done that." Decided what the arrangement is and then told everyone else. A pause. "My dad, my biological dad, it's why he left. She kind of did the same thing to him." I stopped stirring. I stood there in my kitchen with a wooden spoon in my hand, and I listened to my stepbrother tell me, in his halting way, that he had watched our household dynamic for years, and had known on some level that it wasn't right, and hadn't said anything because saying something meant she'd do it to him next. I felt a lot of things in that moment, complicated things, because it would have been easy to be angry at him for the silence. And some part of me was, but mostly I just felt tired and a little sad. Sad for both of us, honestly, for the years we'd spent in that house under the same management and somehow managed to be strangers. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. He was quiet for a second. "She asked me to come home this summer and help them redo the back deck, and I told her I'd do it if you were invited back, and she said..." He stopped. Started again. "She said she'd already handled the situation and it wasn't up for renegotiation." Something about that phrase. Handled the situation. The same language, the same administrator logic. "And what did you say?" I asked. I said I needed to think about it. "Okay," I said. "I don't know what I'm going to do," he said. I wanted you to know that somebody saw it, what she did." I leaned against my kitchen counter. Outside, my neighbor's dog was barking at something. The pasta on my stove was going to be overcooked. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. We talked for another 20 minutes. Not about anything heavy, just catching up the way people do when they realize they've been in the same story without ever comparing notes. He was funnier than I'd known. Warmer. He'd always seemed like the favored one, the easy one, and I'd resented that without thinking about what it was like to be the easy one when the person picking favorites was the administrator. When we hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a while. I thought about what I wanted. Not what I should want, not what would be the mature thing, not what a therapist might gently suggest. What I actually wanted. I wanted my dad. Not the dad who'd learned to be quiet, but the one from the kitchen that morning who'd poured my coffee without asking. I didn't know if I'd ever fully get that. But I didn't want to burn it down either. What I didn't want was to spend the next decade being managed, being handled, showing up at holidays as a problem to be quietly administered. In May, I wrote my dad an email. It took me 4 drafts. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I'd spent a lot of time thinking since November, and I'd made some decisions about my own life that had nothing to do with him, and everything to do with me being okay. I told him that I wasn't ready to come home yet, but I wanted to still be in his life, on terms that were honest, not just manageable. I asked if he'd be willing to meet me for lunch sometime, just the two of us, somewhere in the middle. He wrote back within an hour. He said yes. We had lunch 3 weeks later at a diner halfway between his town and mine. He was early, I was early. We sat across from each other in a vinyl booth and ordered coffee, and he looked at me in a way that made me feel like he was really looking, maybe for the first time in a long time. He didn't apologize for November specifically, but he said something that I've thought about a lot since. I know I let things happen that I should have said something about. I'm not proud of that. I didn't fill the silence after that, I just let it be there. I'm not going anywhere, I told him, but I'm also not going back to the way things were. I can't. He nodded. He looked like he understood in the way people look when they understand, but the understanding is hard to carry. We ate lunch. He asked about my job. I asked about his fishing. He'd started going out on weekends with someone from his office, and he lit up a little when he talked about it, and that was something. We stayed for about 2 hours. When we walked out to the parking lot, he hugged me. Long, the way he used to when I was little. Same time next month? He said. Yeah, I said, same time next month. I drove home. I didn't cry this time. I thought about the version of myself that had stood in that kitchen at age 12 doing the grocery math and making sure my dad remembered to eat, and I thought, she would not believe this. She would not believe that I'd made it here to a Tuesday afternoon in May, with my own apartment and my own insurance, and a lunch with my dad that had been, in its own small, difficult way, kind of okay. I don't know what happens next. I don't know if my dad will ever fully reckon with the things he let slide. I don't know if my stepmother will ever see herself the way I see her, or the way Chip described her, or the way 12 years of accumulated moments add up when you finally write them all down. What I know is this: I stopped waiting for them to give me permission to be okay. That was the thing I'd been doing for years without realizing it, waiting for them to say you can go now. You're free. We release you. And they were never going to say it. They weren't going to say it because they didn't see that they were holding anything in the first place. So I just left. Not with a speech. Not with a confrontation. Not with the dramatic exit I'd imagined 100 times. I left by enrolling in my own health plan and closing a bank account and making a document on my phone that only I would ever read. I left by meeting my dad for lunch on my terms instead of theirs. It wasn't the revenge I used to want, but it was something better, honestly. It was being done. If you have ever been told that the way you feel about something is an overreaction, I want you to hear this from someone who believed that for a long time. Your feelings are not a malfunction. The people who told you that, they weren't trying to help you regulate your emotions. They were trying to make sure you didn't trust yourself enough to leave. Trust yourself enough to leave. That's all I've got. Thanks for listening.